Good afternoon. Welcome. If you don't yet have a seat, please find a seat. We're going to begin rather promptly. We have 2 hours together for this exploration of emerging trends in systemic investment. Really glad to see a full house here today. So there are some people outside who are jealous that they're not sitting in the seat that you're sitting in. So welcome. My name is Melanie Ryan. I'm the CEO of an independent not-for-profit called Unearthodox, and we're really happy to be co-hosting this session with the Trans Capital Initiative this afternoon. And you'll hear from my colleague Dominic really soon about this. So we have 2 hours together this afternoon, and we're going to go through a multifaceted exploration of this concept of systemic investment. Right from on the ground, in the real world, what does this mean, to some of the more modern and contemporary thinking theories. We'll hear from the investment side, we'll hear from on the ground in Africa, and we'll hear from a range of people and places. And this is kind of a concept that brings these two worlds of investing and systems thinking together, and how can this actually help us make change? And I think if you've all been here this week, you know that this has been a really interesting week, foregrounding topics like rebuilding trust, questions around inclusion, intergenerational ideas, justice, equity, diversity, finance systems, society, economy, all these kinds of things. And so I invite you to be really present and take this wonderful opportunity and privilege to be part of this conversation, and then see if you can move any of this into action afterwards. So we have the panel here. I will introduce them briefly. And this afternoon, we will hear from the people here on the stage. And then what we're going to ask you to do is spend some time together in your tables, discussing what you've heard, sharing with each other your insights, and possibly even the next actions and the next steps you're going to be taking based on what you've heard here today. One of the criticisms we often hear of these forums, and I mean not just this forum, but all forums around the world, is that it's nice that we have a conversation with each other, but what are we going to do about it? And I think this is a really practical topic that lends itself to what are you going to do about it? And we'll hear a bit from the panel here today about this. So we have on this end here, Ndidi Nweli, Executive Chair, African Food Changemakers and Trustee from the Rockefeller Foundation. We have Dominic Hofstetter next to her from the Trans Capital Initiative, your Executive Director. Is this correct? Thank you. We have Ralph Kretschmer, Founding and Managing Partner, EBG Investment Solutions. And then we have Jason Jay from MIT, who's going to bring us some really interesting new insights and framing for this work. And he's also been integrating some of what we've heard from Davos into his presentation for the room. And then we have Kirsten Dunlop on the end as well, CEO, EIT Climate. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Dominic to kick us off and help frame the event.
Thank you, Melanie. We are here because of a mismatch. It's the mismatch between the nature of societal issues as complex systemic challenges and the way we think and go about deploying financial capital in service of solving these challenges. Let me explain. Traditional impact investing is steeped in the single asset paradigm. It is the single company, single technology, or single project around which we make sense of financial return potential and impact potential. It's a single asset around which all of that analytic and decision-making happens. And this has worked great for the better part of 2 decades, and it's given us thousands of so-called solutions to address the world's sustainability challenges. But there are a couple of fundamental problems with it. First of all, solutions that work in one place might not work in another. All systems, in some ways, are local. And secondly, simple technology substitution is not going to solve for systemic problems. A traffic jam remains a traffic jam, whether you're stuck in a fossil fuel car or an electric vehicle. So it's now 2024. We're 30 years, almost, a little more than 30 years since the Rio Earth Summit. We basically have all of the building blocks for this low-carbon, climate-resilient, just and inclusive future that we need. As a result of that, the nature of the challenge is shifting. It's shifting away from funding the development of new solutions toward finding ways of weaving what we already have and what is yet to come together, coherently and systemically. In order to do this, we need to adopt the systems lens. And as we do that, we all of a sudden start to see other nodes in the systems across a great many levels of change, whether that's new technology, new business models, policy and regulation, social norms and values, etc. And not only are we going to see the nodes, we're also going to see the connections between them, the interdependencies, the dynamics between these nodes. And not just in the system of interest, for instance, mobility, but also in adjacent systems like energy, materials, or in systems that are deeply intertwined like health. So let me give you an example. We've done work in the Swiss mobility system to figure out how this system can go on its own transformational journey. And we've brought to this the tools and methods from systems thinking and complex system science. One of the outputs of the analytical work is shown here. This is a causal loop diagram. And it has allowed us to understand where that system sits today, where it needs to go, and how it could possibly get there. And based on that analytical foundation, we're able to come up with a theory of change, which is really a hypothesis of how you might want to intervene in that system, upon which we were able to develop an intervention strategy. And some of the results from that work were pretty obvious. So to make electrification happen, you need to build charging infrastructure. Some were real surprises. For instance, the fact that one of the critical bottlenecks in this particular system is the lack of technicians trained to install the charging infrastructure in the first place. And if you wanted to solve those for both of these problems, you would likely need to tap into different capital sources. Now, what this work has also enabled us to then do is get an understanding of what we call funding architecture. What kind of capital, in what volumes, from which sources, against what kind of interventions? Because it turns out that all of these interventions that need to happen will likely have their own funding needs. So, and you know, whether that's infrastructure finance, venture capital, growth equity, whether it's based on market rates, whether it's concessional capital, whether you need philanthropic grants, whether you need the public sector to change, you know, the way design subsidy schemes or tax incentives, or the way corporates intervene in the system, both directly through investments, through supply chain finance, or indirectly through advanced market commitments. So what all of this boils down is really the question of how do you orchestrate different kinds of capital from different sources for different interventions that need to happen in a strategic and coherent way. And this is not how finance operates today, but it's exactly what systemic investing is attempting to do. So definitionally, there's no agreed upon definition of systemic investing. A very, very simplified version of it says that it's simply the application of systems thinking to the challenge of funding systems transformation. And there are 4 implications that come with this. First of all, it's about method. This is a practice. There are elements of mindset and paradigm in there, but it's essentially about practice. It's also about all different forms of financial capital, so capitals in the plural, and even social and political capital where that's available. It is relevant in a particular context, those being complex systemic challenges, and it focuses on creating a particular quality of change, not incremental change, not systems optimization, but deep, structural, and irreversible change. I've talked about some of these key concepts. So when you open the door of systemic investing, you'll step into a world which is still investing. But you're going to start asking yourself a set of questions that are quite different from what you would usually ask yourself as a sustainable investor. You'd be asking yourself about What is a meaningful but actionable system? How can I draw these boundaries? How do I go about setting my change vision, my transformative intent? What are the analytical tools that I can bring to understanding this challenge? How do I go about developing theories of change, identify leverage points, articulate my funding architecture? There's lots to be said about the design of investment programs, investment vehicles to enable systemic investing. There's something to be said about strategic investment portfolio, how you compose your portfolios, select what goes in there so that you can unleash combinatorial effects, so strategic synergies between assets in that portfolio, and nest it all within the broader systems intervention approach. And then finally, there's a big sort of interesting set of questions around the learning and sense making you bring to that effort and how you define success, how you conceptualize impact through the lens of a system. Now, we don't have time to go into detail here. I'm going to pick on the strategic investment portfolios because that's really at the heart of it all. Because the traditional portfolio composition paradigm in finance is risk reduction through diversification. Systemic investing is about value amplification through combinatorial effects. And the ramifications are quite profound because when you come across a potential investment, no longer will you ask yourself, is this particular asset, does it merit investment based on its own? But you're going to ask yourself, how does it make the portfolio as a whole more valuable? Because it's the portfolio that will give you ultimately the systemic impact. Now, some of you will say, oh, this is all theory. And that's right, it's theory. We do need new theory because the theories we're working with today are not working sufficiently well. But that doesn't mean that that theory isn't applied in practice. There are a number of pioneering purpose-driven investors around the world that are already working with some of these ideas, whether they call them that or not. There's Builders Vision in the US doing some fascinating work on oceans. There's the Groundbreak Coalition trying to benefit BIPOC communities in Minneapolis through a polycapital approach. There is CO in Mexico, which does some really pioneering work around food systems transformation. Regen Melbourne is spearheading an interesting approach based on Mariana Mazzucato's mission-oriented approach combined with donut economics to do placemaking in Melbourne. And most recently, the Scottish National Investment Bank has looked into adopting some of these ideas to operationalize its place-based investment mission. There's also a case study that Jason Che has co-authored on the work of the Fink family around food waste reduction, which is available online, which is a fascinating example of how systemic investing has been applied in practice. The organization I work for is called the Transformation Capital Initiative. We exist to build the field of systemic investing, build that infrastructure, the methods, the tools, the metrics, to operationalize this in the real world. We work across 3 different pillars: research for developing the conceptual underpinnings, prototyping to generate demonstration effects in the real world, and then all the relation and social work that goes into field building, the convening, the educating, etc. And because this systemic investing is inherently collaborative, we do collaborate in every piece of work that we do. Here's a selection of the partners we're working with. And if you would like to learn more about this work, there's a number of resources here. There's a white paper on systemic investing that came out a few years ago. We recently published a couple of primers, one in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And for those of you who are wealth owners, impact investors, representatives of family offices or foundations, there's also a training course delivered by the University of Zurich, CSP, that we're contributing to, which will take place in May in Oslo. Now, finally, I realize that this has been a very brief introduction. There's lots that we haven't talked about, from who's going to play the role of strategic capital orchestrator, how the hell do we get institutional investors to buy into a multi-asset class approach, and how do we make sense of all the other dimensions that Melanie mentions around diversity, equity, justice, and inclusiveness. And my fellow panelists will speak to some of that. In any case, if you would like to learn more about this work, or you would like to consider how to get engaged, please see me or one of my colleagues after this session. I'll hand it over to Melanie.
Thank you, Dominic. So please reach out to Dominic or Jason afterwards for more information if you'd like. And right now we're going to let Ndidi take us to a really different space and place and share a different lens on this topic to bring out some of the other aspects. So thank you, Ndidi.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity, and thanks for your excellent presentation. I work out of Nigeria, but cover Africa, wearing a number of hats in the food, agriculture, climate, and philanthropy landscape. And what I'd like to just share are a few guiding principles that I think as we move into this space, we should keep in mind. And I'll use a few examples. So, interestingly, we and most people in this room have been thinking about systems change for a long time, because if you've been doing this work, oftentimes you're most frustrated that you've been working on the same issues and you've seen very little change. And in fact, in some sectors, it's getting worse. A few sectors, it's getting better. But I work in the food and agriculture landscape, and globally, we're actually facing a bigger crisis with climate, economic trends, sending more people into hunger and poverty, and it's not unique to one continent. I think it's shared across the board. So when I think about systems change through my work, and there are a few values I like to put out there. The first one is the importance of partnering with local organizations. Now, I know that localization has been seen as a buzzword recently, and a few DFIs have said, 25% of our funding will go to local organizations. But I realize with systems change and systematic approaches to deploying financing, that if we do not work with local organizations, oftentimes when there is a crisis, capital is the first thing to flee. If that capital doesn't begin in that country, partner with funders in that country, or interact with that country. In our context recently in Nigeria, and just in the last 24 months, we faced the currency devaluation, currency redesign, lots of economic shocks. And we've seen massive capital flights from not just impact investors, but philanthropists and even DFIs. And obviously, if you're doing systems change, you need a long-term horizon. In food and agriculture, it has to be at least 5 to 7 years to see change happen. In one of my projects, partnering with a range of funders called Advancing Local Dairy Development in Nigeria, we're using a systems lens to transform the dairy sector in Nigeria. And what we've seen is, unless you work with local organizations and actually plug the gaps like you've talked about with the mobility in Europe, you will not see the transformation. And in our case, it's been everything from solar-powered boreholes so that there's water in the community, to a feed and fodder industry and creating it, to artificial insemination, to training extension workers, to ensuring financial inclusion, financial literacy, all the way to dairy policy, right? And Harvard Business School has a very good case study of this project, so please look out for it. And why I use that as an example is, if we're going to stick with transformation in any sector, we need the local organizations, because they will stick through the crisis, they'll stick through the shocks, and they will be right there scaling when all the funding has disappeared. And so that's my first guiding principle, is every time you have the opportunity, don't assume that there are no local organizations to work with. Find them, empower them, and where you can, transfer knowledge, innovation, and skills to them. And for the family offices and funders in the room, I'm challenging you to track how much money already moves through local organizations. Most people tell me, lots of it go through local organizations. But when I challenge them to define what local is, who sits on the board, who runs the organization, and how many people from the community are reflected in the leadership of the organization, the numbers start dwindling. The second guiding principle is really one of humility. And we keep learning and unlearning in this space of what is working and what is not working. And for me, humility is a very important principle, because I often feel like in my context, we have had to have a portfolio of financial interventions to solve systemic problems. And we have had to work with that portfolio, because many times you don't have very established industries that work for you. 4 years ago, I created a movement called African Food Change Makers. And the reason I created this movement was because oftentimes we try to solve problems in silos, right, in country. And African Food Change Makers' vision is 1 million entrepreneurs across Africa, nourishing Africa and changing global narratives. And so now we have members in 40 African countries, and we share data, training, research, funding, and markets across the board. Now, the power of community and doing things at scale is important, but through this process, I've learned and unlearned how to fund and build a tech business, because it's really a different type of structure. So for investors, system changers, please remember that you have to keep learning and unlearning what works in what environments, because it's not one size fits all, and I think that's the message you have. But also the sector keeps evolving, and we need new tools, and we need new approaches to financing them. And then the final one, which I think is really important, and I see that this room, and oftentimes when you have rooms on investing, you often see the dynamic, is that we have to put women at the forefront of any systems change investing. And I know many people say, oh, this gender lens people have come again, and gender lens investing, but we're not seeing any movement. I think my friends at Co-Impact and other movements, Connected Women's Network, I think the last statistics showed that only 2 to 5% of climate financing goes to women-run fund managers. Only 2 to 5%, depending on this data, goes to women-run organizations. And so why isn't any class of investment going to women? That's a question. And what percentage should we commit if we're thinking about transforming the landscape to fund women? Because it does make business sense. Women are seen to be fantastic fund managers. Women understand systems thinking. Women have been at the forefront of systems change in many, many ecosystems, and yet the financing landscape has not been transformed to put women at the forefront. And there's lots of data and lots of publications about the bias that still happens as we think about it. And so as we design this new financial infrastructure, how can we put women at the forefront? For me, those guiding principles around localization, around humility, and around women and gender lens investing are critical. Because we can design for a future that we all want, but we don't want to come back here 2 years from now speaking about the same thing. One of my favorite quotes that I currently hold on to, and I'm rounding up, is a Tibetan quote that says, if I tell you my dream, you might believe it. If I show you my dream, you might understand it. But if I involve you, it becomes your dream too. And I think that's where the humility and the conscious human-focused design of systems change, which rebuilds the trust that is often broken in the investment landscape, is required now. And there's a sense of urgency around that. So I look forward to coming back next year to celebrate what we've done together to move this sector forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ndidi, for spending some time with us. And thank you for those insights from your experiences, your work, and your sector. Very, very powerful. And Ndidi has offered us a lens to think through some of these other issues, including gender, and how they can matter in the investment choices. I'm going to give you another quick story to ground this before we go to Ralph.
Can I interrupt for a second? Is it possible to either get back the panel list or bring this down?
We can see if we can move back to the holding slide if you'd prefer. Yeah, thank you. So before I was the CEO of Unearthodox, to use Dominic's phrase, I might have been a systemic investment orchestrator unknowingly 12 years ago. So I used to work for another NGO, and I'll take you to semi-rural urban Australia. Has anyone been to Australia in this room? Oh yeah, it's a good country, right, guys? And what I used to do was work on river basin restoration. And this is a really grounded story about how these things matter and how they're actually very personal to these places and the species that live around the world. So we developed a program. It was a school education program for children in low socioeconomic areas who might not otherwise get access to education about nature, climate, water, policy, practice, all sorts of things. And what we managed to do was work with the state government, the local government, the private sector, and philanthropy to leverage all kinds of investment for this program. And we ended up with these children who would never have had this opportunity in their place, in their space, doing environmental restoration work, freshwater restoration work, species habitat restoration work. They learned how to present in an international forum to policymakers to say, hey, please, this is the future that we want. So we managed to tick these goals that we talk about here on the walls: biodiversity, climate, justice, inclusion, economics, all these kinds of things. And we leveraged all this capital across these different streams in what you might imagine is a systemic investment portfolio. And then what happened is someone in the same government department that gave us the grant built a car park over the environment we had restored. And I'm only telling you this story to highlight the fact of what Dominic has highlighted, that we need to move beyond these piecemeal, siloed approaches to investment. So one, I'm sorry for that government agency. They just wasted their first investment in that process. Two, I had to turn around to 30 kids and tell them that we just poured concrete over their restored home land for koalas and trees and water and all these sorts of things. And if you sit far away from these places, you don't have to face those personal consequences of what this does to communities and habitats. So this is a very real, this is not a theoretical concept. And then I have philanthropists turn around and say, well, what's the long-term impact? Like, well, what is the long-term impact of pouring concrete over the thing we just did together for 3 years? So this builds on the fact that this is not theoretical, this is real. Co-create. Don't work in silos. Do your systems work. And really think about how we're going to join up these different flows of investment. These goals on the wall, they're not that far away in principle. But that place, you know, from 10 years ago now has a concrete car park instead of a flourishing environment. And that's just one story. So hopefully in 10 years' time, we're not coming back and having that same story again. I think that we can do better. And so, Ralph, if you would like to take us to your point of view on this, and we can build on that.
So thank you. Thank you to the host for having me today, and thank you all for so many actually being in this room. It's really impressive. I can also say, especially after listening to Dominic, it's probably the first time since I wrote my diploma paper on environmental investing over 30 years ago that I feel like representing old finance or old economy, old investing. But maybe quickly by way of introduction, and apologies for my voice, EBG Investment Solutions, we work exclusively with institutional investors within customized solutions, and our investment philosophy or approach has actually 3 pillars. One is private markets, second is focus on small and mid-cap, whether we work through funds or whether we work through co-investments. And the third one is sustainability, and sustainability as a driver of return, resilience, and high impact. And that's how we try and essentially bridge the 2 sides of impact, environment, social, and the traditional investment side. So when we look out, just from a risk perspective, and the VEF is typically the time, you know, when that risk has a special notion and is looked at a bit more carefully than otherwise when the VEF risk report comes out. When we look back over the last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we see that the dominating factors long term in terms of risk and negative impact is environment and social. And it's pretty clear that, at least to me and I guess to most of you in here, not to everyone else, unfortunately, that looking at the signs at the wall, if we don't act and act decisively, it's most likely going to be catastrophic. On the other hand, it's a tremendous opportunity if we have some creative ideas and take this, turn this into an actionable plan where businesses can also thrive. So systemic impact investing to me is really, if you want a supporter or even an enabler, a necessary requirement, because what it brings at the end, and I'm especially using these terms now, which are a bit more general, it's about effectiveness, it's about efficiency, it's about acceleration. Here comes the time dimension, and we don't have time. I believe we have much less time than we think on many ends. And then it is also maybe the disruption that we need, because to overcome incumbents might need really attacking from various sides at the same time, because otherwise we see that in many industries, incumbents have the resources to defend the business model to the end, even so it has a lot of harm with it. So we also have, as we heard, the tools now on the systemic analysis side, and Dominic, and specifically Jason as a whole here, will talk about this. So it's all there. We also obviously have all the tools that we need on the business side, on the finance side, to make things happen. And there is enough people, great people, capable people to do it. We have case studies, as we heard, and lots of rooms to really start action and put things to work. Now, I guess what we really need, especially if we think a bit bigger, and that's also what we need, is we need to bring institutional investors on board. And institutional investors, we need them what they need to do is obviously provide capital, but that capital, that needs to come with flexibility, because it's a journey, as we heard before, and when we need to have this flexibility to work with this capital, within boundaries, of course, but with more flexibility than we typically have. And we need patience, because again, we're in a journey, we're learning, and that learning needs to continue. But we also need the institutions on board, because it will then enable, and that's important, them to broaden the thinking, to evolve the thinking. The thinking is, and that's why I said before, looking like old finance, old economy, old investment, is very far away, the way we see it and hear it every day, from what's probably represented in this room. And then obviously from those learnings and from those broadening of the thinking, that should then be applied to the overall portfolio, and not maybe to a small part where they could start with it. And that is then a big multiplier and a big change, because capital has a lot of power, as we all know. So what stands in the way? And it sounds very, 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 very basic, but that's our daily findings. And again, I should say we're one generation behind of what we're discussing in this room, and that is bring institutional money into real impact investing. And I mean impact investing and not ESG investing. So what we found is really the legacies of organization and processes. So first of all, typically what they want to hear is, size. So it's got to be big to start with. Well, how does it get big if it can't start somewhere? Secondly, it has to have a history. Well, at least 10 years, right? But, that history needs to start, obviously. And then ideally should have a brand. Well, brands are created, and that starts somewhere. And then you have all these other things, like obviously people want to be, long-term thinking, but then be liquid on the other side. Now, how does this work together? Then you find, generally that, assets are allocated by asset classes. So it's all silos and different people, and then split into several managers. So absolutely, shielded all from each other. Then you have typically very slow decision making, and what is amazing really is this culture of form over substance. So there's so many more things on the form side, even that we see that people look at when they do due diligence, if we can call this due diligence, rather than in what's really in there and how does it really work. So this is reality as we find it today, and that's the majority of them, I would say. And then we have the human factors, which play also into this, and that is typically, perception of risk. Changing is typically seen much, much, much more risky than status quo. If you look at what I said in the beginning with the WEF report, that's kind of a disconnect. The second one is, I would say, perfection over action. I've heard so many discussing or saying to us that they are in groups, in work groups now, defining sustainability. Okay, those work groups then sometimes work for a year to find out that this is very hard to define beyond what, and so on. And then with all of that and linked to each other is obviously the decisiveness or lack of the decisiveness that we find there. So I think what works and what I've seen work, not on the systemic impact investing side, but in other areas, is really leapfrogging through leaders. You need to have a few individuals and personal relationships where one knows the individual, knows these people are generally motivated in these areas, are willing to dive into the matter, spend some time personally, and maybe just stand up in their organization. Obviously needs to be at the decision maker level somehow, but they can come together, and if you find 2 or 3 with them, and in this case maybe 2 or 3 asset owners and an asset management firm that's willing to undertake what it takes to bring this all together, and then bring also science and the science and the research side to the table. And then obviously there's a willingness to work across boundaries, because these are different worlds, and it takes time, it takes patience, it takes, really, I would say again, a genuine interest in the other side and getting something done. And what you then probably need here, or what I would suggest, is a pool of capital that's sufficient to at least invest around one system. I would actually prefer to have 2 or 3 in parallel, because it's always this thing about you got one shot, and this is really a tremendous task, and it's better if you can really put your bets maybe on 3 and have the learning and have a bit more of substance in the portfolio, but that's what you need. And then secondly, I think all the rest, including the fees or the cost bearing, should come out of usual management fees. I wouldn't change much around all the other aspects, because the more, as I said before, form over substance is really what we see. So basically stick as much to the form as you can and change the substance. This is really what we need. And then bring this together, and then finally have a governance that includes all of them, asset owners, asset managers, and or asset manager, and also science and research, so that this is a matter of trust. This is also a matter of learning. This is a matter of transparency, and finally a matter of multiplier effect. So this has worked, and one of the areas that I can just give you in do I have another minute? Okay. What we're just doing, and again, this is still the anchored in the old world, but moving in, I guess, the more new one. We have teamed up with the oldest German sustainability bank, it's GLS Bank, and actually their asset management arm, and we've worked with them for about 2 years to develop the planetary health concept. So it's going back a bit to the, obviously sits on the planetary boundaries, but has a lot to do with our risk perception that we have. And we have brought that into an institutional investable concept. And we have also teamed up with the Klug organization, which is the German Alliance for Climate Change and Health, which has a genuine interest in all these topics, and is developing tools, is helping to develop KPIs, and we really would like to go in a way full circle. In that also we make the carry payments dependent on a double hurdle and a full double hurdle. That means it's not only the financial performance; it's also 100% dependent on impact targets. So this is very much about making it actionable, making it investable, making it measurable, and move there. And of course, but in a soft way, the way we have laid out the investment focus is based on some implied systemic thinking, but it's obviously not nowhere as near or as far as this proposal goes. But these things are possible. But I think we need to really work together across disciplines. And we need to move into doing things, because time is running out.
Thank you, Ralph. So we've heard some common themes so far in the panel in terms of working across boundaries, looking for multiplier or leveraging effects, how you're going to think bigger, how you're going to run multiple experiments, and these sorts of things. So Jason, do you want to build on what you've heard this afternoon and share a different lens with us as well?
Sure, thank you. So first of all, I just want to share a bit of context about how freaking awesome it is that we're up on this stage in this room. And the reason for that is that last year in Davos, there were a few of us, Charlie Kleisner and Britta Grunig and Adele and a few others who were there, who wanted to have a conversation about systemic investing. And there wasn't a platform for it. So we kind of spontaneously created one. We went to the Wisdom House. We got a space reserved for a conversation. We showed up at the Wisdom House, and there was another event with another group on a completely different topic in our space. And we went to the head of the space, and we said, what's going on here? We reserved this room. And he said, oh, well, I'm interested in complex systems, so I wanted to see how human beings behave amid uncertainty and whether they can spontaneously self-organize. So that's what we did. We gathered a group of chairs. We formed a circle in a hallway, blocking, violating all the fire codes. Fortunately, we were able to ask him to just make sure we didn't get arrested. But we managed to have about 30 people in a dialogue about systemic investing and the possibilities and sharing some of their emerging work. So this is a significantly better digs. We've got flowers, we've got microphones and lights. It's just awesome. And I'm really excited to see this. I think this represents what's starting to happen, which is this conversation about systemic investing is beginning to unfold, and it's beginning to evolve. And there's a summit and a capacity building program and other things that are starting to emerge. So it's very exciting. I think where we are in the field right now is that there have been a few people who have recognized the limitations of the existing paradigms of both philanthropy and impact investing. And Dominic illustrated that beautifully with the kind of dots and circles. As one example, there's an investor who's quoted in this study that we're about to release, who said, "Look, I was playing the impact investing game of investing in single point solutions in food, and we wanted to change the food system, and we won the game as we understood it. We were early investors in Beyond Meat. We took the company public. We made a lot of money. But at the end of the day, we've created another product in the freezer section of the same grocery stores. The plant-based meat companies are competing with each other, and they're rushing for quarterly returns in a pressured short-term market. We didn't change the food system. So we need to do something different." And that friction is what animates so much of what people want to do in this space. And I think that the tragedy that you described is another great example. So that's what's created this discomfort. Then we've had a few people write some inspiring manifestos about what systemic investing could be. And that is a result in part of Kirsten sponsoring Dominic to do that hit to his piece. And those manifestos have started to bring people together. And to define some terms. My vantage point on this, so I teach at the MIT Sloan School of Management. I'm the director of the Sustainability Initiative there. My PhD is in organizational behavior. I was trained by anthropologists. So my orientation is to just go look at what is emerging. I'm also a science fiction buff, and I love the William Gibson quote that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And so what that means is that we just have to go find where are people doing this already, because if we're talking about it, if people are writing manifestos about it, it's got to be happening. That question led us to find Jesse and Betsy Fink. Jesse had made his money as the founding COO of the travel company Priceline. When he took the company public, cashed out, he created a foundation, a family office, and a family farm with his wife, Betsy. They were interested in climate, and they ran a farm. So they saw how much food was wasted getting out of the ground and into people's mouths. And they said, wait, what's going on with this food waste thing? And they had Adam Rain, who is an MIT Sloan alum, start to inquire and write a pathways document to explore what would it look like to understand this food waste challenge and attack it in some fashion. They funded Dana Gunders at the NRDC to do the groundbreaking thought piece about food waste that galvanized the whole national conversation about food waste. They invested in multiple startups, including two of my former students who started a company called Spoiler Alert. Awesome company if you're working on food waste. And they invested in small, local, nonprofit food recovery organizations. But the other thing that they did was that on their farm, one of the income streams was that they would rent the farm out for weddings, and they would set up a tent. And after the wedding, they would ask the caterers, could you just leave up this tent for a couple of days? And literally under that big tent, they would bring together farmers, regulators, scholars, environmental scientists, food companies, both established companies and entrepreneurs, to talk about the food waste challenge. And that led to the creation of a backbone organization called ReFed that began monitoring and data tracking and understanding the magnitude of the food waste challenge and the magnitude of the capital flowing into the solutions to the food waste challenge. And they invested in human capital, training up people, creating fellowships and other opportunities for people to get present to the topic of food waste. They amplified food waste as a topic as the SDGs were adopting it. And the result of their efforts, which we document in the case study that Dominic put up earlier, they put about $5 million of capital into across asset classes, including philanthropy. The result of which is that now ReFed is tracking there's $1 to $2 billion of flowing into food waste solutions every year. And those solutions are reducing millions of tons of food waste. So this was an example of systemic investing that inspired us. And the cool thing is that it wasn't the only, so, like maybe to use another scientific metaphor, we were sort of butterfly collectors, right? So this was one of these precious things that we found. But as we started shaking the bushes through things like the Circle in Davos last year and these other events, we found others, and in fact, a community formed. So Charlie and Ali Kurain and Therold Nustad convened an organization that was initially called IMP Plus. It became TWIST. Together we invest for systemic transformation. And that group just started inviting anyone who was working on investing for systems change to come together and share about their project. And we helped to craft a case study template and sort of way to do that in a structured way. And the result of that is that my master's student, Albin Yao, who's the primary author on that case study, is in this very moment putting the final finishing touches on his master's thesis, where he's looked at 26 examples of investing for systems change and is deriving a fascinating taxonomy and typology of these different efforts, and then doing this deep dive on the ReFed case and a quantitative system modeling analysis of the food waste system to understand how interventions into food waste are complementing each other, and where those synergies are, so that we can bring into both empirical light and analytic clarity the idea that Dominic brought up earlier about the synergies in a strategic investment portfolio. This is a rapidly emerging terrain. This is the leading edge of impact investing, and it's just, like I said, super exciting to be here. What I wanted to do is just understand quickly. Raise your hand if you were in that circle in the Wisdom House last year. Okay, so 4 or 5 of you, great, Risto, and excellent. Raise your hand if you think of yourself right now as an impact investor. Okay, and raise your hand. Raise your hand if for impact investors. Raise your hand. Keep the hand up if you have an aspiration to become a systemic investor. Okay, excellent. Now, there's a number of you who didn't raise your hand. How many of you are involved in innovative companies or solutions that you think are key ingredients of a systemic transformation? Okay, so investors, take note, find them, invest in them, okay? But our objective here, if we'll be successful, is if we can take impact investors to this next level of becoming systemic investors, and if we can take ensembles of solutions that push on complementary leverage points and get them the capital they need across these different pathways in different asset classes. Ralph did a fantastic job of illuminating some of the barriers to doing that, the siloed thinking within the asset management industry and everything else. But what I take great heart and inspiration from, as I said, is that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed, but it becomes much faster in its acceleration when we bring it together, and that's what I think this room is. So thank you so much to Unearthodox and others for bringing us here.
Thank you, Jason. So what I take from that is if you're worried about starting, you're not alone. People are starting everywhere, all around the world already. And so it's an invitation to join them and a very direct call to action here. So thank you, Jason. And thank you for your anecdote about the getting stuck in a hallway last year. We're going to finish with Kirsten on the panel, and then we're going to give you some time and space to discuss and meet with each other before we wrap up at the end. So, Kirsten.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And hello, everybody. Lovely to be here. I'm going to explain a little bit about this reference of Dominic, Kirsten, EIT Climate Kick, and then I'm going to go straight to one very large-scale example, which very much speaks to Melanie's challenge that this is real, this is not theory, and absolutely speaks that the future is not is here, just not evenly distributed. So this is an element where the future is here and represents a very concrete opportunity. So the organization I represent is called Climate Kick. KIC stands for Knowledge Innovation Community. We were created 15 years ago by the European Commission to build the field of climate entrepreneurship, climate innovation, climate solutions in Europe. And we now work in 60 countries doing that, mitigation, adaptation. But we are one of those organizations that 7 years ago reflected on exactly this problem of if you are in the solutions development side, investment funding side, and you inquire with a very, very hard self-questioning lens into the extent to which the solutions you have supported are genuinely changing whole industries or bringing into being the next generation of economies and systems that we need, the answer was no, because there was no means for them to do so, as they iterated on VC models very much stuck in a broken system. So we did initiate a structural shift. We pivoted the entire organization towards working from the outcome back. We are in a situation, and this is ultimately actually a discussion about how much do we understand what is at stake and what is happening. Exactly what is really afoot around us. So we started from the outcome back and said, we need cities that are decarbonized in the next 10 years. We need landscapes that are really climate resilient and regenerative in the next 10 years. What would it take for innovation to create that set of effects? How would you pull that system together? And one of the elements that we really had to deal with is how on earth would we begin to build forward the investment architecture, mindset, systems, practices, habits, behaviors, methodologies, and tools to meet that work and to release and enable and mobilize the capital that we need to do this. So the example that I want to come to is a real thing. It's happening now in Europe, and it's not only a question in Europe, this is also something that is beginning to happen in the US. There's a major initiative afoot that we are now involved in. But this particular instance is the European Commission in its unusual way of creating the boldest climate transformation initiative in the world at the moment, which is 112 cities formally committing to completely decarbonize in 7 years. I'm talking Paris, Madrid, Rome, Amsterdam. They've signed a contract, and this is net zero by 2030. When you start to add up, Climate Kick is orchestrating this work in part because of our gamble to say we need to change the way we are innovating, the way capital is being deployed. When you start to add up across those 112 cities, the amount of green steel, green plastics, green logistics, green cement, green food supply chains that they need, you begin to look, finally, at the shape, scale, and size of the next generation of economies that we need. And finally, you begin to see the directional signal, the scale, the aggregate, the pace, and the interrelated effect, or at least the demand for interrelated effects that we need. Now the challenge comes, how on earth do you get the financial system to come in behind this and enable and structure the innovations that are there? Part of it is structural. You cannot transform cities, and this is, I say cities, but there's a similar set of initiatives afoot also on regions, on food systems, on soil. So there's, if you want to know more about this, come and find out, because this is big. But one thing immediately is exactly what Dominic was describing. You need a portfolio approach, and that is not a distributed effect to de-risk. It is a place-based, structured portfolio of deliberately created relationships among the multiple solutions we need to combine. So if you do take, for example, Madrid, we need, and we are working on, a portfolio that brings together the nature-based materials needed for cladding to retrofit thousands of buildings, the digital infrastructure to connect in-home healthcare, efficient energy, the water and waste solutions, green roofs to deal with heat islands, the ways in which you deal with the mobility and transport system so that indeed it is not about substituting individual vehicles but changing the entire mobility system. Madrid is working on an entire metropolitan forest to completely rewild the entire southern, eastern and western parts of the city so that you change food systems, relationships, skills, education, interdependencies, 15-minute proximities and so on. So you need a place-based portfolio. And what, above all, you're looking to do is bring in multiple hundreds of solutions into relationships with one another. And at that point, all of a sudden, you've got an investable opportunity, but when you really need a systemic investing approach to come in and say, I am interested in taking positions on many of these elements that mutually reinforce or have the potential to mutually reinforce if the flexibility of the capital, the flexibility of the approach and the impact thesis is looking to encourage and build those relationships, but also looking for the scale effects, because this is hundreds of cities. Blue Blocks is an example of an extraordinary green roof solution that suddenly has in demand 112 cities across the entire of Europe. So there is a completely different effect of what's possible. If I were to translate that into what does it mean, so in practice, what would systemic investing entail? It is absolutely about a capital stack. It's about bringing in multiple forms of capital. This is not only about individual private wealth. Let me go back to that example of Madrid. Madrid needs 10 to 15 billion per year in the next 7 years to pull this off. But it's institutional capital, it's wealth. Think about the underlying land value of property that accelerates this degree of demonstration of next generation sustainable businesses, energy democracy, buildings that start to create energy, that create regenerative food systems, that deal with heat, that reduce the underlying heat effects, that begin to reduce the underlying risk of climate. They begin to acquire a value that is very, very different. How do we think about securitizing that value and pulling it forward through the ways in which we begin to invest behind it? And this goes to the key part in systemic that is in part about holistic effects. How do you take the entire system? Because that has a set of mutually reinforcing positive dynamics. In part, it's about the relationships of parts, their relationships, the rules that govern them, and mindset. If we're really talking about systems, you're talking about how you shift those pieces together. But in part, it has to do with the fact that this is dynamic. So we are talking about tipping points, positive tipping points. And one of the net effects of working at this scale is to start to learn, if you invest here, 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 and here, you catalyze speed. You catalyze interconnection, you catalyze acceleration. You do what is called crossing positive tipping points and starting to build market dynamics that really feed each other. And there's some materials you'll find in the resource bank for this session that are exactly about where do we start to see what that looks like. Because if you're an investor, look for those. They are literally the next generation multipliers, but multipliers of value and transformational effects. Then just a couple of reflections overall on what does this mean. As I said, I wanted to come back to the fact that it's about really taking stock of what is afoot and what is at stake. We will have to transition our economies. The question here is, if you're a holder of capital, a manager of capital, a human being who cares to bring economic resource, prosperity, and human activity together in the next generation of economic systems, do you wait? Do you shape? Do you create? Do you scramble behind? Or do you fall out? Because every single day you are making that choice. Where do you position yourself in the way this runs? If you get in early and you shape, you are putting yourself in a position to learn. Madrid does not know how to become net zero in 7 years, fully. It has a bunch of hypotheses, which is what we refer to when we sit here on these panels and say, the solutions are already here, we just have to combine them. Yes, and bullshit. The solutions are here, and when you start to combine them, all sorts of unintended consequences come about, because these are complex systems, and they're complex because we are in them, and we are messy. So it is about getting in and learning, taking positions, and above all, investing behind the capacity of those positions to learn from one another. So the combinatorial effects are not just aggregate effects, they're transformational effects. And that is fundamentally a mechanism of de-risking. The least risky way of getting ourselves in and through the profoundly disruptive world that we are right now in is to damn well get in there and help us learn together how these things combine and how they have transformative effects together. And the best way to get in and learn is to get in behind them and participate. So that's a large part of what this is about. It's about shifting our thesis from thinking that we know, waiting, looking to back the winners, and getting into the VHS versus beta game in a world where the scale, complexity, and interrelatedness of change is so far beyond linear that our best possible bet is do it the other way. Embrace the whole lot, pull in behind them, invest in relationships, look for structuring the rules, and learn faster than the pace of change. Learn through finance, because finance is ultimately what will help us actually catalyze this. And so there's a couple of things going on. One is a massive support for what is happening with the Systemic Investing Initiative and looking for ways in which that starts to play a role in these big European initiatives that do represent a 3 trillion market just in those 112 demonstration cities. And the other is to start to catalyze larger order, flexible, patient funding to build this field and to accelerate this field. And there are a couple of concrete initiatives you'll also find in the resource panel here about trying to do that. I would really want to double down on the invitation. If you want to get involved, if you want to learn together, please join us. This is not about expertise, this is about working out how to do it together.
Thank you, Kirsten. That is a lot to digest from the panel. So many insights, so many different perspectives. So we're going to give you some time to digest it. A couple of things at top of mind for me are you trying to use investment as a tool to solve the car in the traffic jam or the traffic jam? How are you collaborating? Who are you working with? At what scale are you working with? Are you willing to learn? Are you willing to move rapidly together and learn? And how can this be? We've heard about it here from myself, from Ndidi, from Kirsten. Climate, nature, inclusion, gender, equity. These are all parts of the system that we want to work on, and you have the leverage points and the tools to do it if you want to move into, are we focusing on the right problems to start with, and how can we collectively go together? So if we could have the questions on the slide up for people. We're going to give you about 20 minutes in your tables to discuss. Our panel will actually join you and walk around and help with the discussions if you like. And then can you switch to Dominic's slide deck again, and we can have the questions that will help with the table discussions. And then at the end of the discussions, we'll get people in the room who'd like to share some of their insights that they've heard, and then we will wrap up with some next steps and how you can contact people and be in touch with people and resources for you to be using going forward. So as you discuss in your tables, here are some questions that might help kick off the discussions from what you've heard. Please introduce yourselves to each other. You don't have to discuss all of these questions. You might pick one or two. But which 3 core ideas that you've just heard are the most relevant for your professional context, noting that we saw from Jason's question, there's a mixture of people in the room. So you're already working across boundaries, across silos here in your table discussions. You can practice. How could I initiate wider co-creation from your role? Again, you can practice straight away in your table discussions. And who is being overlooked in your work right now? So from what you've heard, who are you not speaking to? What are the 3 main barriers that you need to overcome, and how? What is an experiment incorporating these core ideas that you could run right now in your organization in 2024? Something that's good enough to do, safe enough to fail, and just try it. And how have you been inspired today? Okay, so thank you. You have your table discussions, and we will mingle with the room, and then I'll bring us back together at the end for the close.
How much time are we giving them?
Roughly, let me check the time. Oh, about 25 minutes. Yeah, about 25 minutes. Or 30 minutes, 30 minutes. Yeah. If you're sitting on the edges, maybe join a table if you want to join the discussion as well. Okay. Yeah, good idea.
Anyway, I'm working to eliminate child labor. And then I'm chasing I would like to write.
society issues, and I know that this is. I'm just letting you know that you have about 5 minutes. So if someone hasn't had a chance to talk or you have a burning issue you want to raise, now is your chance before we come back to the group.
because these things are immediate and already like doable. But tell me how many years it takes, I have no answer, right? I'm not a policymaker.
Right.
I'm just working on data and
Okay. Thank you very much. If you could wrap up that last thought and bring it to conclusion. I hope everyone got a chance to talk and share their thoughts on these questions. I have also a colleague in the room. We at Unearthodox are two of us, well, three secretly, here today. My colleague Anka Damaral is going to be roving around the room with a microphone, and we would like to hear some of your insights from the tables. We've got maybe 10 pretty packed tables, so try and keep it brief. It could be around any of these questions or what you heard from the panel, but if you could share back with the room what has been the biggest insight you've taken away from today, the biggest idea, or is anyone bold enough to answer the call to action and is going to do something this year based on what they've learned, heard, who they've connected with? So who would like to kick us off? Hands up. One in the back there. Anka. Who would like to go next so we can be ready? I don't think that's on.
Oh, voilà. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the panel earlier on. It was really fascinating to hear so many perspectives on systems and systems change and systems investing. And we had a nice conversation here. We're from a bunch of different backgrounds. But I think there are 2 points which kind of held the most of our conversation. The first was the question, who decides? And when you're engaging in these complex systems, the word neo-colonialism came up a few times. There are very deep entrenched power structures that need unbuilding. One of the anecdotes to that from our conversation is genuine consultation, so a participatory approach. Obviously, that isn't sufficient by itself, but that kind of came up as one of the hurdles to impactful systems change and kind of the right way of doing it. The other one is what we ended on, actually, and that was a conversation around the challenges borne by the complexity of this thing. If it takes us half an hour to explain what systems change is every time we want to talk about what we're doing, we're going to lose a lot of friends. And so there's a tension point between being complex and going to the end of the point, but also not boring people out and learning how to communicate this in a good way. So those are kind of 2 of the challenges. Is that fair? Good. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much. Who would like to follow up here in the table in the middle? Thank you very much. I like the democratic question there.
It was too late, though. Two are the things that I would like to share with the rest of the room from this table. One was one of the concepts from Kristen, and that was outcome back. So you said something, the previous speaker said something very interesting. Narrative is important. So outcome back, how can we make the narrative more down to earth, tangible, and going beyond the usual KPI, return on investment. Is there more? And the other question that kept us busy, and I think you will find interesting, is it okay to lose money? We are talking about investing, and investing on ambitious projects. Sometimes it's just vision. So, of course, we don't have an answer, but one of the definitions that we put on the table was ambidexterity. Is it probably the solution to be balancing forces? So, old-fashioned business, new business. Last year, oil was the one who was making money. And we follow that. Investment follows the money. And the other form of ambidexterity is long-term versus short-term. We also need that. So these are the things I want to leave you with.
Great, thank you very much for those thoughts. And the question, is it okay to lose money, is something we grapple with when we speak to investors and philanthropists at Unearthodox. And I can tell you there are a lot of people out there who are looking to deliberately have in their portfolio negative returns. They're looking for these other kinds of returns across society. But how do you measure that, right? And how do you move from short to long term? So over here in the front.
Okay, so two things here. One, I just wanted, is a little bit in response to what we just heard about, are you losing money? Is it okay to lose money? Something that Dominic said on stage is really important, is that the difference between constructing a portfolio as a way to mitigate risk through diversification versus enhance value through synergy. And those are really different paradigms, right? It means that if I'm going to invest in and we were talking about this example of the table, if I'm going to invest in a telehealth company, the diversification thing says I should invest in 10 telehealth companies in the hopes that one of them succeeds. But all 10 of them could fail if the insurance company isn't reimbursing for telehealth. So it's the complementarity of multiple different interventions that is the systemic approach. And sometimes when people hear, oh, we're going to combine philanthropy with investing, that means it's really concessionary. We're going to lose even more money. But in fact, if the philanthropy is creating the enabling conditions, like changes in the rules of the game, like broader awareness, like investing in human capital that's a limiting constraint, then actually the success of the private investments could be even much greater. So it could be a way to make even outsized returns. So I think we have to be clear not to kind of equate systemic investing with a sort of uber concessionary. Sometimes it might be if you have a spend down foundation. That might be what's essential for certain problems. But we want to just, I've encountered that mental model a lot. The other theme that came up at the table here was about human capital. Several of the companies are directly investing and thinking about mental health, both of the founders and entrepreneurs as well as the ultimate beneficiaries. But also that even if we're working on electric vehicles, the investment in the talent and the technicians and the people who are capable of taking care of those electric vehicles is a critical piece. It's something that you discovered independently in Africa to what Dominic described earlier in Switzerland, and is also something that Albin found when he was looking at the food waste system modeling, is that in making sure that there are sufficient talent pipelines for all the new stuff that you're going to build. We've seen efforts at building retrofitting run into challenges because there's not enough good, trustworthy contractors out there to do the retrofitting. So that's a common extra leverage point in addition to solutions development that comes up in a lot of the examples in research.
Great, thank you, Jason. Who would like to share? We haven't heard from this side of the room. I'm sure you're all very insightful people. Oh, here we go in the front.
Just going to add one more dimension that came up in conversation here, which is about the role of the orchestrator. Who is best positioned to coordinate strategically those different capital flows? And one of the things that we've come to sort of understand is that it depends on the system, but there's a more general need to think about a new kind of financial intermediary, a strategic intermediary for specific systems, right? And that intermediary builds a coalition, brings people in, the actors that are needed within that system, builds bridges, conceptual, linguistic, translations, etc. Possibly maintains a shared strategic intelligence platform, the systems analysis, the data that's required, possibly helps design and structure investment programs, etc., etc. So oftentimes there's no clear natural home for this kind of work. And none of the other financial intermediaries or business models, be that brokerage, asset management, investment advisory, really see that as their remit. So the question is, what would that look like? How could it be designed? What's an experiment we can run to birth a new kind of financial intermediary?
Excellent. That's a challenge to the room. Does anyone want to respond to that or add anything to what they've heard so far? We've got a couple more minutes before we need to wrap up. Right, down the front here. Thank you, Dominic.
Okay, thank you so much. On our table, we had a couple of topics that were already discussed, like financial return, right? And it's much more complicated because without a blended capital stack, as Christine pointed out, system change can usually not happen, right? And I think it dovetails with your observation about who orchestrates that and so forth and so on. And the governance of these change efforts, we don't know how to govern that yet, and so I think that's a whole research topic, and what's what works and what doesn't work, and how to actually lead and facilitate with humility, and letting the emergence and the co-creation actually evolve. Right? I think that's a topic that this community needs to address and move forward. And one thing that I brought up, that's really important for private investors, individual investors, is their participation and their influencing the system and vice versa. So inner transformation for outer transformation. Systems don't change by themselves, but we change them and they change us, right? And it's an illusion actually to think that systems are out there and we are here, and we need to integrate that into the equation as well, which is more challenging on the institutional side and much easier to do on the private side. And maybe we can build bridges between these two efforts, because I think it's necessary to include consciousness and awareness in that discussion too.
Thank you. It's a very important point. I mean, systems, we construct them, we imagine them, we build them, we can reconstruct them, reimagine them, and rebuild them. They are made up of us. Okay, so any final comments? Does anyone brave enough to share an action they're going to take? Anyone in the room? Or it's till over here, right, in the corner. No matter how small or big, we applaud you for your action. Unless, of course, it's going backwards and rejecting this whole discussion and leaving the room. Oh.
Take 1 and 2.
Yeah. Oh, you've got 2? Good, okay.
Sure, we'll start.
Yeah.
Yeah, one action is I might change my career. No. 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was trying to raise funding for a startup that everyone said that you're moving too many parts, and I think this should have been here before. So now that I'm sort of moving into academia, where I want to enable people who are maybe on the same path, I think of one thing that the second speaker said about the gender lens, and I think this is representative for all of the actions that I'm actually thinking about in the next few days. Who in the system is not at the moment at the table, and who in the system has enormous resources, skills, knowledge, different experiences. And I think in case of finance, and in the case of many leadership positions, it's women. And I think that's what I try to do when I do teaching, when I do research, and I think that's what I'm taking.
Excellent, thank you. Everyone be this man's hype, people. Yeah. Okay, who was next, Anka? You had another one. Good.
Hi, so my name is Pauline Kerber. I run a fund called She Equity, so Gender Lens Fund. And we did a pilot to just understand how ecosystem of investing in Africa works. And we realized it's very much broken. Like everything indeed you said, it's very true. So now I'm working with partners to structure a systemic approach to investing that will build a value chain where at the end our outcome we're seeking is to create jobs for women and the youth. So the fund will be focusing on women and the youth. And the youth in Africa definition is under 35 years old. So we want that by 2035, we create at least 2 million jobs and support at least 1 million women and youth. And now, basically, we're in the process of structuring this. So I invite anyone who wants to be a part of this ecosystem to join me, because we can do it, and we believe that it starts by us Africans, as indeed said, working with everyone around the globe to make it happen. Thank you.
You have an active invitation to take action. Thank you very much. Okay, wow. So we're at the end of our time. Thank you very much for your listening, your participation, for sitting in very uncomfortable chairs for 2 hours. I know I've sat in these chairs a couple of times. What we do at Unearthodox is we take people from big ideas to action. So we're a little bit like a thinkubator. We help people move through hard conversations about systems change for nature and society. We help them reimagine the future, and then we build out pipelines of innovation in innovators that make it real. I can tell you, if you can reimagine the future, there are people who know how to build it all around the world. So we have global conversations and then relocalize that in the context and the landscapes and with the people who know the places that they live in. So that's what we do. And this is part of what we do it in a way that we do it is bringing people together to have these hard conversations and rethink about the problems in the future. So thank you very much to Intent for hosting us here this week. Thank you for Trans Capital for being a great partner. Thank you to our panelists. So could the panelists all stand up for me again, please? Dominic, Jason, who do we have? Ralph. Am I missing anyone? I think Kirsten and Didi had to leave. Also an invitation from these people that if you want to get in touch with them, speak to them while they're here, please approach them. They're happy to share any expertise. Does the Trans Capital, do you have any other team members in the room?
Yes.
Stand up, please. Thank you very much. And Anka at the back is with Unearthodox. So if you want to talk about our next portfolio work, which is going to be on regenerative futures. So how do we move from sustainability to regeneration for nature and society? We're just opening our next innovation portfolio on this. So come and have a chat to us on any topic that you think should be of interest to us and our global community. So thank you for your time, thank you for your thoughts, and thank you for those who are taking action.
Gentlemen, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. The front edge.
On the West Coast? Yeah, the West Coast part?
Find it. There's a white people. I'm not very active. Right now, we spend the weekend. Look at his name. Black. I'll get it in a second. Olle Marke. Olle Marke. I'm half Swedish, so that's we are. lot of treaties. So they're actually going for single investment, not only designing a portfolio, but actually